Welcome to the License to Lead podcast. I'm Patty Fay. This podcast is for physicians or anyone who thinks healthcare needs a transformation led by physicians. License to Lead means that physicians are charged with and must be in charge of guiding the vision and the culture of healthcare systems. In today's episode, I'm continuing my conversation with Dr. Amanda Goodall, who works in the business school at the University of London. In our last episode, we dove into her leadership research and specifically the underlying reasons why experts in the core business of an industry make better leaders than those who have a general business background. This is such a big deal. Medicine in the U.S. is different than in most other Western countries, and it's different from the other traditional professions like law and engineering, because in the U.S., physicians are the CEOs in only about 5 or 6% of hospitals and healthcare systems. I wonder how much of the crazy-making dysfunction in U.S. healthcare is created by misalignment between the medical profession and a business school ideology. For more on this topic, License to Lead episode number 3, which is titled, Who Are the Masters of Healthcare, is a look at the research regarding MBAs and business schools. In this part 2 of the discussion with Amanda, we talk about leadership development for physicians, some of the unique needs that physicians have, and how healthcare organizations can adapt to bring in more diversity and to discover the best physician leaders. We launch right into our conversation here with Dr. Goodall talking about the program that she leads in the business school at the University of London. Amanda, you run a master's degree program for physician leaders, the Executive Masters in Medical Leadership, and it's for physicians. Can you talk about why you set this up and anything else that you can tell us about that?
Yes, it's been a very, very interesting experience. I was sort of thrown into the medical world through that one paper in 2011, and I've kind of become quite stuck in your world, Patty. And one of the things that happened as a result of all of that, of becoming more and more involved in healthcare, was to set up this degree. And I'd always had a hunch, a number of feelings about business schools and management, but also particularly about experts, that I guess the way I see a lot of things, there's been a very generic attitude to leadership and management. And I felt that doctors really deserved their own degree. And it was fascinating. There was a lot of resistance to this. The political correctness lobby didn't like it at all. We were pitching for a contract from a major London hospital. The CEO loved the research. But there was about 8 or 10 people on this committee. One of them was a doctor. The rest of them were other healthcare professionals or managers or whatever. And the feeling was really bad. There was about 6 of us who went in. We did a good presentation. We came out and we all said that was shit, wasn't it? The atmosphere was terrible. So I got in touch with the hospital CEO and said, we were treated pretty badly, pretty shoddily, really. And I think he was a little bit upset about this and he hadn't been able to make the meeting. So he put me in touch with the organizational development person in charge of it. And I was pretty grumpy, and I'm not very good at disguising my grumpiness, unfortunately. So I said that we felt very unwelcome in that room, yet we had some really senior people there. Eventually, she admitted that, yes, there had been some people in the room who said, well, what's so special about doctors? And I thought this was very poignant. And all of this stuff is, of course, new to me because I'm not a medical doctor. And so I found it fascinating. My instinct about the degree was that doctors, that they learn differently, that their tolerance for learning some of what I call the blah, blah stuff from management schools is probably lower than it is for some others. I got told by people, well, why should doctors learn leadership management on their own? They don't work on their own, they work in teams. And I often say, well, you don't expect nurses to join doctors on their medical degrees, and nor do you expect doctors to join nurses on their nursing degrees. So why is it that we don't think that doctors are allowed to have some leadership and management learning on their own? They probably do learn a bit differently than other professionals, and nurses probably the same. But the main thing that we wanted to recreate, or we wanted to create in the group, on the degree, was a safe space for doctors to let their hair down, because a big part of our degree, an area that I know you focus on a lot, is holding a mirror up to themselves. Our attitude is that if you want to be a leader or a senior manager, you have to first look at yourself, hold that mirror up to yourself. The joke that I always say is if your mother told you that you were too short when you were 12, you don't want to spend the rest of your life penalizing tall people. You got to deal with that pretty early on. So we try and do that through coaching and other techniques that, again, I know, Patty, you're involved with as well. I mean, it's quite emotionally challenging. It's quite therapeutic. And we wanted doctors to feel that they could be in a safe space with each other to really open up about their weaknesses, about their strengths, etc. Now, it is a multidisciplinary setting. I mean, we have doctors from all specialisms. So in some respects, it is incredibly multidisciplinary, multi-specialty. So we found that very interesting. And I have to say, we need more data. But so far, we have found incredible response. We've had people being promoted into very senior positions after like 3 or 4 modules of the degree. And the feedback and the response from others has been fantastic. And in fact, the Health Corporation of America in London, based in London, they are one of the sponsors who put doctors on the degree, and and many of them are going immediately into leadership positions. So we think the empirical evidence from the degree seems to be very clear, and also the fact that they're doing the learning on their own. But it was interesting, and I think it opens up a can of worms, is why are people so threatened about the idea of doctors going into leadership?
Something that I brought up in my first podcast, the first License to Lead podcast, where I gave an overview of really my reasons for creating a podcast, which is all about fanning the flame of physician leadership. And one of the elements was a certain antipathy, sometimes a disrespect or hostility towards physicians by others in the organization. I think the point that you make is how critically important is it to make sure that we have excellent leaders and the best possible leadership development program is delivered. The last time you and I talked, you had Zoomed me into your classroom so I could give a presentation and do some Q&A with the physicians in your executive masters in medical leadership. Can you say more about that program?
Well, the program is one that's designed, tailored for doctors. So a lot of the areas are on personal leadership development. You were contributing because of your expertise, both as a physician executive, but also your current work in motivation and development, leadership development for physicians. But we do everything from finance and business, health analytics. We do marketing, and also they do what we call a business leadership impact project, which is that they do quite a major piece of work around something within their institution that really needs to be changed. It might be something to do with patients. It could be a new system for, it varies actually. And it's done in conjunction with the hospital. But it's a major project that they have to lead on themselves. A bit like a consulting project, which is something we're trying to encourage hospital doctors to think about, creating their own consulting mindset, their own consulting abilities within their own institutions, rather than going outside and wasting money on management consultants. But that's another story. So yes, we've got a range of subjects. One of the key things about this course as well, which I found was really important, was often, and we have a great doctor from a hospital, St. George's Hospital in South London, and she was on a very early program with which the NHS spent a lot of money on. And we always get her in to talk about how can you best use your course? How can you apply it? And one of the big issues is that if you take people away for a long time into another setting with lots of done-out people and talk about leadership and all the rest of it, these people become motivated, they learn lots of stuff, lots of theories, blah, 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 blah. And then you bring them back sometime later into their own institution. Nothing's changed here. I've come back this kind of bionic, amazing person ready to make change with the rest of it. And oh, look, everyone is just still the same. They're not just waiting for me to come back and change the institution. So it makes landing back in your old institution where everything's essentially the same very difficult. So what we wanted to do was to we have a Friday and a Saturday, which discriminates against some religions, unfortunately, but we couldn't find other days. So it's the end of the week. a Friday and a Saturday every month. And they have these intensive days with each other, training about whatever it is, strategy, or whatever the subject happens to be. And then by Monday or Tuesday, they're back in on the job. And so they've got all their new learning, their intensive learning with each other. And it's very experiential, the course. And then they're back into work. And I think that's a very important part of management training as well, that actually you learn these things and then immediately you're back in the workplace and you're thinking, right, there isn't a distance between those two things. And you're kind of never fantasizing about what the institution might be. You're actually hit with it immediately. This is the institution. Now, how am I going to apply this back into where I am? So I think that's a really important part of it as well.
Lynn and I have done a lot of work in organizations, but also in central locations. So we ran a big fellowship program out in Washington, D.C. for many years. And we faced that issue with them coming to us and then going back into the institutions, newly invigorated, but surrounded by the same old blah, blah. And one thing that we did to try to address that, because we had people from all over the country coming into a location for the fellowship program, we would bring multiple people. We would really encourage those institutions that were sending folks to send 3 or 4 people, to send a team. So just so they wouldn't be so diluted when they go back, and they'd have some people to share the information with, and more of a force to make change in the organization.
Very clever idea. I might have to nick that one from my book.
So I'm wondering, when we think about an MBA, Master's in Business Administration, I often call it the BSM or business school mindset. I think of it as being one of the biggest problems in healthcare leadership, using the financial modeling, all the measuring and metrics. What are your thoughts about leaders who are steeped in that sort of business school philosophy?
I think what's happened with business schools is, and I think they are at the heart, and I'm in a business school and I don't want to do my business school out of a job. Somewhere along the line, expertise got separated from management. And I think that part of that divide has happened through business schools, because business schools will sell MBAs. And it is interesting when I teach MBAs and I teach them about my expert leadership research, and some of them say, oh shit, I did this MBA because I want to change my career. And now, blah, blah, blah. And I kind of say, well, it doesn't mean you can't change your career. Just it's better to be aware that you also need to know what you don't know. But I think that's one of the problems, is that we've created an industry around saying you become a good manager and you can do whatever you like. You can run any kind of organization you like. And I think that is a problem. What I believe, and that's why I think our degree is successful, and I think we need much more of this, is tailored management education that is tied to many of the sectors that people are working with. And the reason I think that's important is the management education stuff needs to be tied back closely to the management that is stuck on the expertise. If the management is the custard on the pie, if you like, and the expertise is the pie, that's the core business. That's what it is. It's a law firm. So you need to understand how to manage law firms, and you need to understand the management has to be enveloped around that core business expertise. And in some sense, business schools have kind of taken it away and are selling management degrees to 12-year-olds, really, some of them straight out of university. And I think this is a bit insane, personally. I think we need to have much more tailored management that is, again, attached to these different fields. Now, an MBA in itself can be useful. And I wouldn't say a lot of the physician executives and the physician leaders in the American study had MBAs. They were MDs and they were MBAs. And I think once you, after maybe our course, you might want to do more and maybe would want to do an MBA at a very high level with people from other settings. I can understand that, absolutely. I've got no problem with that. And I think MBAs are good. One of the main reasons I think MBAs are good is because of the experience and the level of the expertise of the individuals doing it. So you are bringing on there a lot of experience and stuff. But personally, I just think we need to bring the management education back with the management and the expertise and kind of all in the same place, and not exclusively. And I do say this, that I'm not saying that physicians should always learn about leadership with other physicians. No, it's really good to learn about it with different people from different sectors. We do learn stuff. There are different practices in different sectors, which, inevitably will roll over into ours. And we should know if there's inspirational processes or technology or anything that we could use. So we need to know that, absolutely. But I think what business schools have done is they've separated it all out far too widely. And then I guess the other side of it is that business schools have gone through this cycle in their lives, and this has been written up in histories many times. They were trade schools, and trade schools were seen as too sort of practice oriented. So they needed to become more academic and scientific. And now they've kind of swung the pendulum too far that way, and they're sort of desperate to be seen as scientific, and they've become obsessed with theory. So some of the theories that they have in management papers in the top journals, I mean, to me is a lot of it is BS, I'm afraid. The Academy of Management, for example, I think it's propagating an obsession with theory, which I just don't think people in the quote unquote real world are ever going to understand, and they're not going to use. So I think that's another problem with business schools, that we've gone too far into this theoretical pseudo theory. Another thing that's been good for business schools and business is that I think governments, and we can all think of our own governments right now, particularly, is that governments don't really like experts. For governments, experts are a total pain in the ass, because you want to tell someone just to do something. Your voters want something to happen, and you want to turn to a group of people and say, just do it. And experts are going to say, sorry, I'm not going to do this because it contravenes my own practices that control my profession. There's going to be lots of reasons why they might turn to data and say, but we know it isn't going to work. And governments and politicians don't like that, because they need instant action to satisfy the voter. And that's why some countries where their democracy doesn't exist, for example, in China, where these things, they can take a long view because they don't have to worry about the short-termism of the voter. So in that sense, I think also what happens is that they get business people, or they get non-experts who are much happier about doing things. Experts might say this is a bit dodgy. Now, COVID has been interesting because they've had to talk to some experts, though obviously in America, I don't think Trump has really taken any notice of experts. And even in Britain, we've put these non-experts in charge of track and tracing, and it's been a disaster.
It's mighty inconvenient to have a professional who has ethical obligations to patients, ethical obligations to behave in a certain way, to have them in your healthcare system bucking what you want to do.
Exactly. And I think, a very similar point to yours, Patty, is they don't understand the setting that experts are in and how they work. They put in all these managerial processes, a bit like strings on a kind of, puppet. And that's to control them. So they have to tick all these boxes. I always say to journalists, when I do interviews with journalists, I say, imagine there was someone who didn't know how you work as a journalist. And when you go off for 2 days, this person who doesn't understand it thinks you're lying in the sun somewhere having a nice holiday. And so they decide that they're going to put in all these processes. You have to phone in every 2 hours. You have to send me a photograph. You can imagine that happening, can't you? Because they don't understand how journalists work. Absolutely. These metrics and performance measures and managerial processes are kind of a way for a non-expert to sort of control and assess experts, because they can't do it themselves. They don't have the capability to do it themselves.
They don't necessarily understand what the experts are doing. So it's very difficult then to understand how to manage those experts. And it's a little threatening. And I think we see some of that dynamic as well, where people feel threatened by the experts in the organization. They're an inconvenience and a threat sometimes.
We haven't talked about that, but there is quite an interesting paper that shows that people become aggressive when they're bosses and they're around areas that they don't understand. And I'm sure that this will come into it. There will be people who feel a particular way react a particular way because they don't have what they perceive to be the status of those experts, because they feel outside of the club of those experts, etc., etc. And that's a whole nother psychology, but I'm sure that plays into some of this as well. And probably the other way too, let's be honest, we've all known doctors who may at times have looked down on people who were different from them. This is something that human beings do all the time, of course.
So I think this links also to other elements of the work that an expert leader can do. So a physician can spot the belligerent physician and can avoid hiring that person. And if they inadvertently get hired, that expert leader is much more capable of doing the needed performance management. So I think other elements here that affect the organizational culture, recruiting, selection, performance management, and as you mentioned earlier, the coaching, bringing people along more fluidly and more effectively if the leader is an expert in the core business. So, Amanda, there's been an assumption that physicians don't want to become leaders and managers. And is that anything that you've found to be true?
It's funny you should say that, really, because I got an email invitation from a woman who runs an organization that represents all doctors in Denmark. And they sent me this message saying, Amanda, you must come to Denmark and talk to our doctors and tell them that they've got to go into leadership because the government's about to do something terrible and it's going to really blah, 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 blah. So we had a chat and I said, well, how do they know that doctors don't want to be leaders and managers? And she said, well, that's just the assumption that everyone makes. And maybe they're not putting their hand up, whatever. So I said, well, why don't we ask them whether they want to become leaders and managers? So in 3 weeks, 3 women, me, Agnes, and this lovely woman from this Danish organization, sent a survey out to all doctors in Denmark. And we got, it was over Christmas, and we got a reasonable response. It was not, it was about 18,000 we posted. We got in about 4,500. And we actually asked them, what would incentivize you and what are the disincentives? So what this survey enabled us to do was to actually understand the thinking of doctors in Denmark, a good healthcare system, whether they would think about becoming a leader. If they didn't, why didn't they want to? And we also managed to ask them about leadership development. Would they be interested in doing leadership development? Anyway, 70% of respondents, so of the sample of the people who responded to our survey, 70% of them said yes, they would consider going into leadership and management. And essentially they outlined the reasons why they wouldn't, what was important to them. And it was exactly the same for men and women also. And the reason we did the study is not to go into the details necessarily about their incentives or disincentives, but the same thing, they also recognized that they needed leadership development, which we found quite surprising. But I guess the study, for me, the way I kind of closed the study was really just to say, organizations often say they want physician or clinical leaders. And instead of actually sort of asking them why they're not coming forward, they just expect those experts to come to them and take on these leadership management roles. And the way I view diversity and also expert leadership is, if you want a woman, if you want an African American, if you want an outstanding doctor to be a leader or a manager, then you have to ask them why they are not stepping forward right now. And you have to think about, what do we as an organization have to do in order that they will come forward and that they will step forward. So the organization has to adapt itself to meet the needs of the people they want to step forward, rather than always expecting those people. We need more women, come get the whips out and get those women stepping forward. No, if they're not coming forward, ask what they want. Why aren't they? Understand the issues surrounding that, and then change the damn organization. Don't expect the woman to change, the black person to change, the doctor to change. You have to change the organization to suit those people you want. And that, I think, has been missing. And I think that was the main thing about this Danish study that really came out, was just thinking about, what can you do to promote those people? So the other side of it that we've learned is that you really need to support and develop people and nurture them to go into leadership positions, and particularly in settings where, for example, the doctors say it's very managerial. They're very worried about burnout. These issues came up a lot, as you can imagine. And so therefore the organization has to really think carefully about what they can do to promote and develop these people. And the other thing that I think is very important as well in general in leadership and management is very often what we do is the organization goes, who wants to be a manager? Apply here. And they let people decide in a sense. So, oh, look, it's really surprising. There's 3 white men who all look identical to each other who put their hand up. So let's give the job to one of them. And I think if you really want the best people, you have to go looking for them. You have to identify them. You have to nurture them into coming forward. Don't just take those people who put their hand up first. If you really want to encourage the best, and also the best and the different, you have to work as an organization to make that pathway a really, really safe one for these people to be able to step forward. And I think that's also true about great doctors, is people who love what they do. And yet, I mean, Peter Lees always says this, who's the head of the Faculty of Medical Leadership and Management in the UK, that doctors love their clinical work, nurses love their clinical work. And what he says is that he realized that as a single physician, he can help patients in many ways, but only singly patients really. But when you become a physician leader, you have the opportunity to help hundreds of patients, essentially, many, many patients. And I think that's a really, really fantastic way of looking at it. But organizations have to really bend over backwards and support them. And I feel exactly the same way about diversity. I really do. I think we need more women. We need more diversity. We need the best, but we also need diversity. And the organizations have got to adapt to suit them and not the other way around.
And I think a sinister side of expecting the female candidate, the African-American candidate, the physician candidate to step forward is that there is a correlation between significant narcissism and the desire to be the boss of you and me. So, you're almost selecting for people with narcissistic traits if the attitude is, who wants to be the boss of everybody around here? That is a real risk. And certainly people that are on the far undesirable end of the narcissism spectrum are quite overrepresented in leadership. And that, again, is something that needs to be tackled, a topic for another day, but really a purposeful method of making sure that people with those traits are ruled out, not in, when it comes to selecting leaders. Another point too, Amanda, that you made me think of is often the physicians are really, it's not even so much a matter of incenting them. They are actively disincented to take on leadership roles. Sometimes they're moving into a half or full-time role. They may actually take a pay cut, which is an outrage. If we're talking about bringing in the most exemplary physicians into a role, there's absolutely no reason for them to take on something like that. And what I see so often in a room full of physician leaders is those who have maybe a chief role, part-time, 0.2, maybe it's 0.5. They're working the same anyway. I mean, they really aren't given the time. And then people kind of roll their eyes at them when they don't show up to the meeting. But they're getting up early. They're rounding on patients. They're, on the computer for 2 hours every night doing their, data entry for their patients. And they're supposed to be taking on a leadership role. And then they're given the side eye for not showing up to this meeting or that meeting. It's really an unacceptable situation. And I think all of those things have to be looked at. It should be made very desirable for the best of the best to move into leadership.
You touched on another very important issue there, which is a lot of places insist or have got so much management and managerialism, etc., that clinicians, physicians walk away from their clinical work, and that they have to do that. And that's quite common in many places. And that, to my mind, is a mistake as well. It's part of the incentivizing that if a physician wants to carry on doing some clinical work, that should be built into their job as well. They shouldn't be forced to walk away from the clinical work if they still want to carry on doing it. Now, obviously, the higher up you get once you become a CEO, and I remember a great story from someone who was a senior clinical lead at Michigan, who came to become the lead at Yale Medicine. And he was asked, he was a surgeon, and he talks about how he had to basically demonstrate that he could do surgery quite well when he arrived at Yale. And he talks about all these people leaning over his shoulder, kind of watching him to see how he did. And when they realized how well he could perform at that level, then they kind of let him get on with running the organization. It was like he had to show that he could perform as a doctor. And then the other doctors just let him get on with his leadership and stuff. It was very, very interesting.
Wow. They must have read your research, Amanda. He had to be exemplary at the core business. That was a requirement. So I would just love to hear your reaction to where we are. Your first study that I was acutely aware of was the 2011 U.S. News and World Report's research. That was 2011. Are we stuck, or are you seeing any movement?
Yes, it's a very interesting question. I mean, I think what's interesting is that the UK and US are in a very similar position. So we've got about, 6% maybe physician leaders at the top of these organizations. We're both quite similar. Whereas if you were in other countries around the world, actually, you would have a greater presence of physician leadership. And have things moved on? Well, the research has definitely moved on very, very positively. There's organizations, this Faculty of Medical Leadership and Management in the UK has definitely got much more support behind it. And there seems to be more commitment from the government and the NHS around physician leadership, although I still think there's a very long way to go. I hear stories from different colleagues in the States just about how nurse leadership seems to be moving faster than physician leadership, partially because they have permanent jobs and because they can do their management training more easily for some of the reasons that we've already outlined. In this country, it feels like it's going in the right direction. Let me say that, but it doesn't feel to me like it's moving fast enough. Now, whether COVID has a bigger influence on all of these things, because suddenly doctors, physicians have been sort of pushed into the front line, although in our case, we're obsessed with epidemiologists and public health people rather than physicians, and that's another discussion. But I'm hopeful that things are moving in the right direction, but I do think we've got further to go. But I think in this country, there is a much greater awareness around medical leadership and the importance, because there's more and more research coming out showing that if you've got a clinical degree, you are a better manager. I'm somewhat positive, although I do think it's not moving fast enough. Now, you will know more about the situation in the States, and I don't know how frustrated you are about that.
Well, I think that the coronavirus pandemic has absolutely highlighted the importance of physician leadership and the role that physicians play, and further increased the credibility that physicians have when it comes to what's going on with people's health and what should be going on in our healthcare systems. I know you wrote an article about the COVID-19 pandemic and how it's tested the physician's leadership skills. Do you have other thoughts about that?
Well, I thought what was really interesting was with the doctors that we were training, they all had to leave the course quite suddenly because of COVID and go back to the front line exclusively. So all training of any kind was, halted in this country. And it was interesting because some of the feedback we were getting about how suddenly some of the kind of operational stuff, maybe slightly over managerial, was kind of the wave was parted, and some of that stuff was put to one side where the physician influence, the doctors and all the rest of it could step forward. And so in a way, the clinical leadership and clinical influence seemed to be highlighted as being far greater during COVID. So what I did was I kept hearing these comments from our doctors about the way things seem to be changing. So we put together an article for the Financial Times where we had we had to cut out a lot of stuff, but where our doctors were reporting on how they were using their management education that they were getting from us in COVID itself. And it was fascinating. In a way, that was a real test for us, that if we can produce kind of leadership management training and in a crisis, they're actually using it. That was amazing. Now, what's interesting where we are now is that some people have said that some of the old crap has kind of slipped back in again. So doctors are maybe not as prevalent as they were, say, in March. But some of them think that there have been changes that have moved on. So I think there has been some positive stuff that's happened. But I think most importantly, I feel that doctors themselves have realized their own importance in leadership and management in healthcare. And I think that's the most important thing, really. It's given them, it's shone the light on their role and their competence, and then the need to have them there. As leaders and managers. I don't know if you agree, Patty.
Yes. One of the folks that you quoted was an emergency department physician who said that he thought that COVID-19 had revitalized the NHS. And I think a lot of what we see and hear is this is really tapping into the passion that physicians have for patients and for healthcare. And I think physicians are energized by being in a role where they lead, where their skills are being used. And it's very different from the somewhat sorry state that healthcare has progressed to, where physicians spend, 2 hours on the computer doing data entry for every 1 hour that they're face to face with a patient. So, like you said, that kind of bureaucratic stuff really got streamlined. It got set aside. And the physicians and nurses and technicians really brought their leadership to the forefront.
Yeah. I think it is very interesting that a lot of the outstanding healthcare systems in the States, like the Cleveland Clinic and the Mayo's, they've been physician-led from their inception. And I think that is very interesting. They may have been, obviously, health insurance imposes a whole load of stuff on American healthcare. And then you've got, obviously, the fact that the country is quite litigious, and we are now too. Holding all of that constant, in a sense, these places have actually created, one could argue, institutions where the best want to work. Now, I know that some of the way they contract with doctors is quite challenging. You're on a 1-year contract and all that kind of stuff, which some would find very difficult. But nevertheless, I find it interesting that these places have always been physician-led and are doing very well. And I think it would be very interesting to let doctors or experts just run their own places and run them exactly how they want to.
Right. With a lot fewer layers of administrators. We don't need that much interpretation. And I think that a lot of that disappears when there's physician leadership in these kinds of organizations. And certainly those two, Mayo and Cleveland Clinic, have been in the top 5 on the U.S. News and World Reports, year in and year out. They have demonstrated their outstanding outcomes.
Yeah.
Well, I just have a couple of other questions. We're going to wrap it up here. You've been extraordinarily generous with your time. I really appreciate it. Do you have a big, hairy, audacious goal when it comes to, you can address either your work or your life?
What I'm trying to do now, what I'm trying to work on is a book, which is a book that's targeting outside of academia. I mean, I do as much media stuff as I can. I do non-technical articles. I write in newspapers because I really feel as an academic, especially an academic in a professional school, in a business school, that it is our responsibility to disseminate our research and make it relevant to the quote unquote real world. I think that is so important. And I don't think nearly enough academics do that. They've become so inward focused. And I feel that's very important. So this book is basically about trying to take all the research that we've talked about today and really try and make it applicable to people in all sorts of settings. So that's something that I'm working on now. And I'm doing that partially also because I feel we've reached a time in life in the world's development where experts are so desperately needed. And I'm not just thinking about COVID, I'm thinking about climate change mainly. We have got massive species decline. The world is basically destroying itself. Humans are destroying the world, and we really do need to listen to experts. So we need to elevate the status of experts so that they'll become listened to. So that's what I'm doing. And that kind of links to my role as a Tiger ambassador, actually. I'm extremely worried about species decline in the world, and I'm a Tiger ambassador, but it's really just symbolic of other species is to try and support those species that are declining in the world. And that is very many. So I think that's really, really important. And it also ties into my interest around experts.
I have the opportunity to see you. Our listeners won't have that opportunity, but there's the most beautiful photo of a tiger right behind you. So good on you for being a tiger ambassador. Like you said, the species decline is a horrific impact on the planet. And I think we all have to have some real energy around preventing that from happening. My final question, do you have a meditation practice?
I don't meditate, I have to be honest, but I have 2 canine comrades, and I do a lot of walking. Right now I'm speaking to you from the west coast of Wales, which is very beautiful. I do a lot of walking on the coast, and that to me is meditative. So I love doing that, and it's very, very beautiful. And I suppose, that me, Andrew, and the 2 bitches are all walking out on the cliffs. That's about as meditative as I get, but it is wonderful.
What are the 2 bitches' names?
Tiger and Lily. I always name dogs. I always have dogs after dead relatives and friends.
Tiger Lily.
Yeah.
Okay. So where can listeners find out more about your upcoming book or reach out to you?
Well, and I'm very open to people. As I said, I'm very sincere about the need for us to disseminate our research. All of my work is available on amandagoodall.com website. Everything is there, the stuff that I'm legally allowed to put up there, which is, I do it anyway. And the book will be out probably not until spring 22.
Okay.
Yeah, but I'm about to start work on it very, very soon. So, but all the other research is up there, and anyone is welcome to get in touch with me.
And it's a very accessible, excellent website. So I really encourage listeners to go there. Tell us again the name of your website.
It's www.amandagoodall.com.
Super. Thank you so much. This has been just excellent having a chance to talk with you.
Thank you, Patty.
Thanks for listening to the License to Lead podcast. Be sure to visit licensed2leadpodcast.com to join the conversation, access the show notes, and sign up for our newsletter. Leave us a message with your provocative question or your thoughtful comments. You might inspire a future episode of the License to Lead podcast. Thanks so much, everyone.